The morning light broke through the half-drawn curtains, casting long shadows across the room. The air smelled faintly of lavender and coffee, a scent that lingered in her apartment like an old memory. Nora stood at the window, gazing out over the bustling streets below. It was the kind of morning where everything seemed like it could be new again, if only she knew how to let go of the past. Her hands gripped the edge of the windowsill as her heart thudded uncomfortably in her chest. The invitation had arrived this morning, the one she had been dreading. Her mind flashed back to the night she met Dylan, her now ex-fiancé. It had been 7 years ago, a summer evening filled with the kind of light that made everything seem possible. They had been young, ambitious, and a little bit naive. She had believed, like many others, that love could solve all things. But love had a strange way of hiding its darker side, and it wasn't long before Nora saw the cracks forming in their perfect facade. But that was a lifetime ago. She hadn't seen Dylan in years, hadn't spoken to him since the breakup. Yet here she was, staring at the invitation in her hands, as though the universe was playing some cruel joke. The wedding. Dylan was getting married. He was marrying Stella, the woman Nora had once called a friend. The woman who had taken everything from her, including her heart. The woman who had always been better than her in every way. The woman who had broken her down, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but bitterness. The invitation was simple, elegant. White with gold lettering, the kind of card that spoke of wealth and class, things Nora had once aspired to but had since lost interest in. The ceremony was in 1 week. 1 week. And yet there was something about the invitation that felt unfinished. It was the line at the bottom, the one that read, "I hope you can come." Nora's fingers tightened around the edge of the card, crumpling the paper slightly in her grasp. She could almost hear Dylan's voice in her head. "I hope you can come." The words, so casual, so insincere. It was the kind of thing someone says when they want to make you feel wanted but don't actually care if you show up. But why had he sent it? Why now, after all these years? Was he seeking some kind of closure? Did he think that, after everything, she would just come to his wedding and smile for the cameras like a good little ex? She shook her head, pushing the thoughts aside. There were things about Dylan she would never understand, and trying to figure them out now would only lead her back into a world she had worked so hard to escape. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced down at the screen. It was a message from her sister, Ivy. "I'm going to a bridal shower this weekend. Want to join me?" Nora's fingers hovered over the keyboard as she considered the invitation. She had no interest in attending any more bridal events, especially not ones centered around the kind of love that had torn her heart to pieces. But Ivy always made these things seem fun, even when they were anything but. Before she could respond, another message popped up. "By the way, have you heard from Dylan?" Nora's heart sank. She hadn't expected that question. Not from Ivy, not from anyone. It had been years since the breakup, and no one had ever dared to ask about him. Dylan had been a ghost in their family's conversation, a subject so charged with pain that it was better left untouched. Nora paused, fingers still over the keyboard, considering her response. What was the right thing to say? The truth? That she had received an invitation to his wedding, that it felt like a slap in the face? She took a deep breath and typed back. "He sent me an invitation to his wedding." Ivy's response was almost immediate. "Oh wow, that's unexpected. What are you going to do?" Nora stared at the screen, wondering if Ivy truly understood what the invitation meant. It wasn't just about Dylan or his wedding. It was about everything that had happened between them. About the lies, the betrayal, the way he had turned her into a shadow of the person she once was. It wasn't something that could be fixed by attending a wedding, by offering some fake smile and pretending things were fine. The phone buzzed again. "I think you should go. For closure." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. Go, closure. Those were two things that had never quite gone together in Nora's world. The idea of attending the wedding was absurd. She had spent years healing from the wounds Dylan had left, and now he wanted her to come back into his life. He was already moving on, building a life with someone else. He wasn't her Dylan anymore. But then again, was there anything left to lose? She thought of the last time they had spoken. It had been after the affair, the lies, the betrayal. She had asked him, desperately, how he could do it, how he could throw away everything they had. And he had looked at her with that same half-hearted smile, the one that had always been so hard to read, and said, "I never meant to hurt you, Nora. But I don't know if I can be the man you want me to be." At that moment, Nora had known. She had known that everything between them had died, long before she was ready to admit it. Now, 7 years later, here he was, inviting her to witness the life he had chosen without her. To watch him walk down the aisle, to see him marry Stella. And yet, she couldn't deny the pull, the nagging feeling in her chest that perhaps this was the universe's way of giving her the chance to truly move on. For closure. She had never been good at letting go. A deep sigh escaped her lips as she set the phone down. Her fingers brushed the invitation again, this time more gently. She had a decision to make, and it wasn't just about going to a wedding. It was about whether she could face the past head-on, the ghosts that still lingered between her and Dylan, and finally lay them to rest. Nora stared out the window, the city below her moving on without a care. She had spent too many years running from her past, pretending that the scars didn't exist. Maybe it was time to confront them. Maybe it was time to show up. The next few days were a blur. Nora tried to ignore the weight of the invitation still sitting on her desk, as if ignoring it would somehow make it disappear. But every time she walked past, its presence became more insistent. The paper, with its cold elegance and gold lettering, seemed to mock her every time she glanced at it. She knew she couldn't avoid it any longer. It was Tuesday evening when she made the decision. After work, she went straight home, a cold cup of coffee clutched in her hand, the long commute from the office weighing heavily on her shoulders. She kicked off her shoes, her feet sore from a day of meetings, presentations, and dealing with the incessant demands of her boss. She hadn't even realized how exhausted she was until the stillness of her apartment enveloped her, like the deep breath she had been holding for too long. With a sigh, she walked over to the desk and picked up the invitation. She read it again, her heart racing as if it were the first time. "You are invited to the wedding of Dylan Taylor and Stella Matthews." Nora swallowed hard. Her fingers trembled as she ran them over the delicate paper. It was absurd. She couldn't be here, letting this control her life. But the choice wasn't hers alone. She had to decide if this invitation, this ridiculous gesture, was going to drag her back into the past, into a life she had so carefully distanced herself from. The logical part of her wanted to throw the invitation away, forget about Dylan, forget about everything they had been. But the emotional part, the one that had carried the scars of their broken relationship for so long, was screaming to face him, to confront the years of unanswered questions, to finally understand why he had left her behind. She couldn't lie to herself anymore. She had spent 7 years avoiding him, avoiding the truth, and now the truth was standing right in front of her. Her phone buzzed again, interrupting her thoughts. It was Ivy. "So, any thoughts on Dylan's wedding?" Nora leaned against the desk, considering her reply. The question was innocent enough, but it was one that carried so much weight. How could she explain this to Ivy, to anyone? She didn't even know what she wanted herself. "I'm going." There it was, out there in the world. The words that would pull her back into a past she had tried to bury. She didn't have a plan, not really, but she had made up her mind. Maybe this wasn't just about closure. Maybe it was about something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. But she couldn't ignore the pull, the desire to understand why things had ended the way they had. Ivy's reply came quickly. "Wow, really? That's brave of you. You sure you're ready for that?" Nora hesitated, her thumb hovering over the phone. Was she ready? She wasn't sure, but she had never been one to run from challenges, even when they were wrapped in painful memories. "I don't know, but I think I need to be." Her phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't Ivy. It was Dylan. Nora's heart stuttered in her chest, the name on the screen enough to send her into a momentary panic. She hadn't heard from him in years. Not since that fateful day when their relationship ended in a mixture of anger, tears, and accusations. Seeing his name now was like stepping into a dream she hadn't realized she was still having. She hesitated before opening the message. Part of her wanted to throw the phone across the room, just to rid herself of the looming question of what he wanted. But another part of her needed to know. She needed to understand why he was reaching out after all this time. With a deep breath, she opened it. "Nora, I hope you're doing well. I know this might be a little out of the blue, but I wanted to reach out before the wedding. I've thought about you a lot over the years. I realize I never gave you the closure you deserved, and for that, I am sorry. I just wanted to tell you that I never meant to hurt you. I never meant for things to end the way they did." Nora's fingers gripped the phone tighter as she read the words again. So many emotions flooded her: anger, confusion, disbelief. What was this, an apology? After everything he had put her through. After the lies, the affair with Stella, the way he had walked away without even giving her a chance to speak her truth, he continued, "I hope you can come to the wedding. I know it might seem strange, but I hope it'll bring some kind of peace for us both." Nora put the phone down slowly, her mind reeling. She couldn't believe it. After everything, after the betrayal, after the pain, after years of silence, he was asking her to come to his wedding, to witness the life he had built without her. Her fingers still ached from the tight grip she had held on her phone. The words peace and closure seemed almost cruel coming from him now. It was too late for that. She had spent so many years rebuilding herself, piece by piece, only to have him waltz back into her life with this request. Her thoughts were interrupted by another message from Ivy. "So, are you going to reply?" Nora stared at the screen, the words flickering in front of her. She didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to respond with anger, to demand answers for all the years of hurt. Another part of her, the part that still longed for some kind of reconciliation, wanted to tell him she understood. But was that even possible? Finally, Nora typed a reply. "I don't know why you're doing this now, but I'm going." Her thumb hovered over the send button for a moment before she pressed it. There was no going back now. Whatever came next, she would face it head on. Her phone buzzed with a response almost immediately. "Thank you for understanding. I'll be glad to see you." Nora's stomach turned at the sincerity in his words, the apology, the invitation. It was all too much. But it was also exactly what she had feared, a twisted attempt to fix the past by pretending it could be erased. She stood up, pacing the room as she tried to make sense of everything. There were so many questions, so many emotions she couldn't sort through. Was she doing this for closure? For revenge? Or was she simply trying to prove to herself that she could move on, no matter how difficult it might be? In a way, the choice was already made. Dylan's wedding was in 1 week, and she had already committed to facing him. She just had to figure out how to walk into that church and how to confront a man who had once been the love of her life. Nora's days leading up to the wedding felt like a strange dream, one where she was floating in a sea of confusion. Each morning she woke up, a gnawing sense of anxiety pressed against her chest, reminding her that her past wasn't truly gone. It was right here, waiting for her in the form of an invitation, and now, Dylan's messages, each word wrapping around her like a noose. She couldn't help but feel like a stranger in her own life. The woman who had confidently built a career, who had learned to trust her own instincts, was now just a shadow of that person, torn between the desire to close this chapter of her life and the unsettling pull of what might happen next. It was the night before the wedding when she stood in front of her mirror, staring at her reflection. What was she supposed to wear to the wedding of the man who had left her behind for another woman? Something elegant, something understated. She didn't want to stand out, yet she couldn't deny the desire to be noticed, to somehow remind Dylan of who she used to be in his life. She sighed, running her hands through her hair. The woman in the mirror didn't seem like her. She didn't look like the woman who had once been so sure of herself. This was someone who had been fractured by time, who had tried to fill the cracks with work, with friends, with distractions, but nothing could erase the weight of Dylan's absence in her life. "Tomorrow," she whispered to herself, "tomorrow will be over." She wasn't sure what that meant. She wasn't even sure why she was going to the wedding. There was no reason for her to try to find closure with a man who had already made it clear where his heart had gone. But then again, there was part of her that felt like she owed it to herself, owed it to the version of herself who had loved Dylan with everything she had to show up, to stand tall, to confront the memories. The church was a stunning sight, elegant, white, with tall pillars that seemed to stretch endlessly upward, making the space feel both grand and intimate. Nora had arrived early, wanting to take a moment for herself before the chaos of the event overtook her. She didn't want to walk in with a throng of guests, their laughter and chatter creating a deafening noise in her head. The quiet hum of the church was soothing in its own way. There were flowers everywhere, vibrant arrangements of roses and lilies, their fragrances mixing in the air. There was a soft sheen of sunlight filtering in through the stained glass windows, casting a warm glow over the polished wooden pews. Nora found a seat in the back row, close to the aisle but not too conspicuous. The last thing she wanted was to be the center of attention. She knew how small this moment felt in the grand scheme of things, just another day in the life of Dylan and Stella. But for Nora, it felt like the world was hanging on a thread. As she sat there, trying to gather her thoughts, she couldn't help but glance around at the guests filing in. Some were familiar, others completely foreign to her. Old colleagues from Dylan's work, distant relatives of his, and even some people who looked like they had stepped out of a fairy tale, dressed in gowns and tuxedos, their laughter filling the space with a sense of occasion. A few moments later, the doors at the back of the church opened, and the sound of music filled the room. The guests stood up, their heads turning toward the front. Nora's stomach clenched as she looked at the scene unfolding before her. The wedding was about to begin, and every ounce of her being was on edge. She could feel her pulse quicken as the bride made her way down the aisle. It was Stella, dressed in white, her blonde hair cascading down her back in perfect curls. She looked radiant, as beautiful as she had the last time Nora had seen her. At the moment, Dylan had walked away from their relationship and into the arms of another woman. Nora felt a knot tighten in her chest. The woman who had replaced her, the woman who had taken everything from her, including Dylan. Stella's eyes never met hers, and for a moment, Nora felt relieved. She didn't want to be seen. She didn't want to make things harder than they already were. As the ceremony began, Nora couldn't help but feel like an outsider. She didn't belong here, not among these people, not among Dylan and Stella's world. But still, she couldn't look away. She watched Dylan, standing next to Stella at the altar, his back straight, his eyes forward. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the room, and Nora's heart skipped a beat. Dylan's expression was unreadable, but she could have sworn he hesitated, just for a second. It was enough to make her stomach churn. The priest continued the ceremony, his voice steady as he recited vows and promises of love and commitment. Nora listened, but the words felt hollow. How could they be anything but empty, when everything between her and Dylan had been left unfinished, unresolved? And then, as if sensing her internal turmoil, the room began to fade away. The soft music, the whispers of the crowd, all of it seemed distant. She could feel the pull of her emotions, the memory of her younger self, the woman who had believed in love, in happily ever after. Nora looked down at her hands, her palms suddenly clammy. It was as if a veil had fallen over the ceremony, and she could no longer see the man she once loved. Instead, she saw a stranger. A man who had chosen a life with someone else, a man who had never once come back to her, not even when everything had crumbled. The reality of the situation hit her like a ton of bricks. Dylan wasn't the man she had known. He wasn't the boy who had made promises under the stars. He wasn't the person she had given her heart to. And for the first time in years, Nora felt a sense of clarity, a deep understanding of what this was. This wasn't about Dylan or Stella. This was about her. This was the last time she would allow herself to be trapped in the past. The wedding reception was every bit as extravagant as the ceremony, and for the first time that day, Nora felt herself pulling away from the bubble of confusion that had enveloped her. The music, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, it was all too much. She stood by the tall glass windows, the cool evening air refreshing against her skin, trying to collect her thoughts in solitude. The guests were too absorbed in their own worlds, each person dancing to a tune that didn't belong to her anymore. Dylan and Stella were at the center of it all, the picture-perfect couple. Everyone around them smiled and congratulated them, seemingly in awe of the future they had ahead. But Nora, from her distant corner, saw what no one else seemed to notice. There was a tension in the air, a subtle dissonance that only those who truly understood the past could feel. Dylan, standing beside his bride, caught her eye across the room, but this time there was no hesitation, no flicker of recognition. He smiled, a smile that was hollow and polite. He turned his back almost immediately and pulled Stella close, whispering something in her ear. The moment was jarring. Nora felt a pang in her chest. The emotional undercurrent of her past was too powerful to ignore. The man she had loved, the one who had once been her everything, had transformed into someone else, someone unrecognizable. It was painful to see him pretending, to see him so clearly moved on, when she couldn't seem to let go. A few moments later, Stella joined the group by the bar, leaving Dylan alone. It wasn't a fleeting moment of freedom. It was the opportunity Nora had been waiting for, even though she didn't know what she would do with it once she had it. A part of her wanted to retreat into the shadows, to turn away and leave, to walk out and never look back. But she didn't. She couldn't. For the first time in years, she found herself taking a step toward him. She walked, slow but deliberate, across the polished floor of the reception hall, each step echoing louder in her mind than in the real world. As she neared him, Dylan noticed her, and for the briefest moment, his expression faltered. His smile dropped and his brow furrowed. "Nora," he said, his voice flat, "I didn't expect to see you here." His words struck her like a slap in the face, but she held her ground. She knew what she needed to do, even if her heart told her to walk away. "I wasn't sure I'd come either," Nora replied, keeping her voice steady. "But I thought it would be fitting." Dylan seemed to stiffen at her words, and the awkward silence that followed only deepened the divide between them. She didn't want to talk about the past, about the broken promises, the abandoned love, but it was the only thing left to say. She had to confront him. "Do you ever think about what we had?" she asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. Dylan took a long breath, and she saw him glance over his shoulder to where Stella was laughing with friends. It was the briefest of glances, but it didn't escape Nora's notice. He had already moved on. Of course," he answered. "But things change, people change, it's just the way life works." It was a cop-out, a well-rehearsed line that at one time would have crushed her. But now, as the words sank into her consciousness, she realized something. There was no closure in this moment. There never would be. The Dylan she had once known wasn't here anymore, and neither was the Nora who had clung to him. "You were always so sure of yourself," Nora said, the bitterness creeping into her tone. "You always knew exactly what you wanted, even when you walked away from me." His eyes met hers, a flicker of regret clouding them, but it vanished just as quickly. "I never meant to hurt you," he muttered, almost as if he was saying it more for himself than for her. "Well, you did," she replied sharply, stepping back. "And I'm still dealing with the aftermath of that, but I'm not the same person anymore, Dylan." He hesitated, his expression a mix of uncertainty and guilt, but before he could say anything else, a familiar voice called his name. "Nora!" It was Stella, her bright smile never reaching her eyes as she walked over, her arms sliding possessively around Dylan's waist. "There you are, I was looking for you." Nora's smile was polite, but it didn't reach her eyes. She looked between the couple, her throat tightening. The words she had wanted to say to Dylan felt trapped in her chest, and now the moment had passed. Stella, in her perfect wedding dress with her flawless beauty, was everything Nora had once tried to be, but that Nora was gone. She had learned how to let go. "I didn't mean to interrupt," Stella continued, her voice saccharine sweet. "It's just, we've missed you. Dylan and I have been talking about you lately, how things didn't work out the way we planned." It was a strange thing to say, especially considering how distant they had all been for so long. "I'm sure you have," Nora said, her voice level, "but I'm glad to see you both happy." The tension in the air was palpable. Stella's smile faltered ever so slightly, but she quickly recovered, leading Dylan away, her fingers laced around his arm. As they left, Nora watched them, her mind swirling with 100 thoughts. She couldn't help but feel the deep, aching wound that had never truly healed. But there was something else too, something that had slowly begun to surface. A realization that had taken root the moment Dylan's eyes met hers. It wasn't just the past that was difficult to reconcile, it was her future. She had spent so long trying to convince herself that everything was fine, that she could move on from this, that time would erase the pain. But now she knew. It wouldn't. Not until she finally confronted what had happened, what he had done to her. And for the first time in a long time, Nora understood the weight of what she needed to do next. The days following the wedding felt like a blur, each one drifting into the next with no real sense of purpose or direction. Nora had thought the event would bring some kind of closure, maybe a finality that would help her move on from the past and from Dylan. But instead, it had left her feeling emptier than before. Every part of the world she once knew, everything that once made sense, now felt foreign. Nora spent most of her days at her family's estate, in the room that had once been hers as a child. The tall windows, framed with heavy drapes, looked out over the sprawling gardens. The air was thick with the scent of roses, but Nora barely noticed. It was just another reminder of how life continued, even when you felt stuck in place. Her phone vibrated against the wooden desk, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from Marissa, her closest friend and confidante. Marissa, I know you don't want to hear this, but you have to let him go. For real this time. He's married. He's not coming back. Nora stared at the message for a long time, the words echoing in her mind. Her fingers hovered over the screen, tempted to respond, to say something that would feel like a defense of her heart, something that would justify the way she had been clinging to the past. But she knew the truth, deep down. Her heart had been in denial for far too long. For the first time, she deleted the message without replying, the act feeling like a small but significant victory. She stood up, stretching her stiff muscles, and made her way downstairs. The estate was eerily quiet, the absence of family members amplifying the loneliness she had been avoiding for weeks. Nora's parents had long since left for a business trip abroad, leaving her alone to sort out the wreckage of her emotions. When she reached the main floor, the sound of a doorbell broke the silence, a sudden intrusion that startled her. It was too early for visitors, and her heart skipped a beat as she wondered who it could be. She opened the door, expecting to find a delivery person or a family acquaintance, but instead she was met with an unexpected sight. Dylan? He stood there on the doorstep, his posture stiff and hesitant. His hair was slightly disheveled, and his eyes, those same eyes that had once been so warm and familiar, now held a mixture of uncertainty and something else she couldn't quite place. He looked different, older, perhaps even worn by the weight of the decisions he'd made. Nora, he said, his voice low. Can we talk? She didn't know what to say at first. She hadn't seen him since the wedding, and though she had tried to push him from her mind, the sight of him brought back memories she'd rather forget. She swallowed hard, forcing her voice to stay steady. I don't think there's anything left to talk about, Dylan, she replied, trying to shut the door, but he quickly stepped forward, blocking it with his hand. I didn't come here to hurt you again, he said, his voice urgent now, as if the weight of his own regret was too much to carry alone. I need you to listen. Nora hesitated, her mind racing, her emotions all over the place. What more was there to hear? Hadn't she listened to his empty promises for years? Hadn't she already heard everything she needed to? But something in his tone made her pause, just long enough to let him in. She stepped back, motioning for him to come inside. As he entered, the familiar scent of his cologne filled the room, and for a moment it felt as though no time had passed. That moment was brief, though, and the walls she'd carefully built up over the past few weeks started to solidify in her heart. Nora led him into the sitting room, where a fire crackled softly in the fireplace. She took a seat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap as she waited for him to speak. Dylan sat across from her, his gaze never leaving her face. He looked as though he were searching for something in her expression, something he couldn't quite read. I don't expect you to forgive me, he began, the words coming out slowly, as if he were struggling to put them into the right order. But I need you to know the truth. The full truth. Nora's pulse quickened, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment where everything would be laid bare. It was almost surreal. She had spent years wondering what had happened between them, and now, perhaps, she would finally get the answers she had longed for. Go on, she said, her voice quiet but firm. I didn't marry Stella because I loved her, he admitted, his eyes dark with regret. I married her because I was afraid. Afraid of losing everything, afraid of facing the consequences of my own choices. I told myself that marrying her would be the easiest way to move on from you, but it was a lie. I couldn't forget you, Nora. I never could. The words hit her like a wave, crashing over her and leaving her momentarily breathless. She had never expected this. She had expected guilt, maybe even some form of regret, but not this kind of honesty. Why didn't you say anything? She asked, her voice cracking slightly. Why didn't you come to me? I was a coward, Dylan confessed, his voice tight. I thought that if I stayed away long enough I could bury my feelings, but I couldn't, not when you were so close, not when everything about you still haunted me. Nora's hands trembled in her lap as his words sank in. She wanted to be angry. She wanted to scream at him for how much he had hurt her, for making her feel like she wasn't enough. But now, faced with the rawness of his confession, all she could feel was confusion. So, what now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. You think we can just pick up where we left off? You think I'm going to fall back into this after everything? Dylan opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, there was a sharp knock at the door. Nora's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the urgency in the knock. It was her mother, who had returned early from her trip, clearly unaware of the unexpected guest standing in her living room. The timing couldn't have been worse. Dylan, Nora said, her voice steely, you need to leave, right now. He hesitated, his face a mixture of frustration and desperation, but Nora could see that the moment had passed. It was too late for him to undo what he had done. Too late for her to ever go back to the way things were. Goodbye, Nora, he said quietly, before turning and walking out of the room. The door closed softly behind him, and Nora let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. Her hands were shaking, and her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. She had expected closure, but what she had just received felt like more of a puzzle piece than a complete picture. Dylan's confession hadn't fixed anything, but it had stirred something inside her. As her mother entered the room, her gaze shifted between Nora and the now empty doorway. Who was that? Her mother asked, eyeing her curiously. Nora stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of the past and the future pressing down on her shoulders. It doesn't matter, she finally said, her voice steady. I need to move on, and I will. Nora felt a quiet emptiness in the days that followed Dylan's visit. It wasn't anger or resentment that lingered, those feelings had come and gone long ago. Instead, it was a deep, insidious sense of loss, one she didn't know how to name. The clarity she had been searching for felt distant, like a lighthouse on a foggy horizon, faint and unreachable. It had been nearly a week since Dylan had come to her, spilling his regret like a broken dam, but nothing about that encounter had given her the closure she'd anticipated. In fact, it had only deepened her confusion. His words should have been enough. He should have been enough. But no matter how many times she repeated them to herself, it still wasn't enough to repair the fractured parts of her heart. Her mornings were the worst. She would wake up in the large, empty bed that felt too cold without someone beside her. She would lie there for a while, staring at the ceiling, knowing that today, like every other day, she would be forced to go through the motions. Get up. Eat, pretend. It had become exhausting, this constant game of pretending everything was fine when the truth was that her heart had been hollowed out, piece by piece, for years. The phone rang, snapping her out of her reverie. Startled, she reached for it, expecting a work call or something mundane, but the name flashing on the screen made her stomach twist. Marissa. Nora's heart skipped. She hadn't spoken to Marissa in several days. She hadn't even been sure what to say. But Marissa had always been there, through thick and thin, and in a way, Nora felt guilty for pulling away. She swiped to answer. Nora? Marissa's voice was cheerful, but there was an undercurrent of something else in her tone, a slight edge of worry. I need to talk to you. Can you meet me for lunch? Nora hesitated for a moment, then nodded, even though Marissa couldn't see her. Yeah, sure, where? How about the cafe by the park? You remember the one? Nora smiled faintly. She remembered. It was their spot, where they had spent countless afternoons together, talking about everything and nothing. It felt like a lifetime ago. All right, I'll meet you there in an hour, she replied, trying to inject some semblance of normalcy into her voice. The call ended, and Nora stood from the couch, her mind already racing. She wasn't sure what Marissa wanted to talk about, but something about the way she'd asked made Nora uneasy. It was more than just catching up. Marissa's tone had hinted at something urgent, something important. The cafe was a cozy little place with a few tables nestled under a canopy of trees. The air smelled of fresh coffee and pastries, and the soft hum of conversation surrounded Nora as she entered. It was a quiet refuge in the middle of a bustling city, and for a moment, it gave her a sense of calm. Marissa was already there, sitting at a table near the window, a steaming mug of coffee in front of her. She waved as soon as she saw Nora, her smile wide but not quite reaching her eyes. Hey, Nora said, sliding into the seat across from her. What's going on? You sounded serious on the phone. Marissa sighed, taking a deep breath before meeting Nora's gaze. I don't know how to say this, but I think you need to hear it. Nora's chest tightened. What is it? I've been talking to someone. Someone who knows Dylan. Someone who, well, someone who's been keeping track of him, and they told me something I think you should know. The words hit Nora like a punch to the gut. The air seemed to thin, and she found herself holding her breath. What do you mean? Who is this person, and what are you talking about? Marissa hesitated, then leaned in, lowering her voice. They said Dylan didn't just marry Stella to move on, Nora. There's more to it than that. Much more. Nora felt her pulse spike. What are you talking about? Is this some kind of— They said he was forced into it, Marissa interrupted, her voice barely a whisper. That he didn't have a choice, that there was pressure from his family, from people in his life who had leverage over him. They made him marry her, and if he didn't, there would have been consequences. Nora's mind raced. It felt like a sudden whirlpool of disbelief. How could that be possible? How could Dylan, someone who had been so sure of his love for her, allow something like that to happen? That's crazy, Nora murmured, shaking her head. Why wouldn't he tell me? Why wouldn't he just leave if it was so bad? Marissa bit her lip, looking uncertain. I don't know, but I think you need to consider the possibility that maybe Dylan hasn't been the villain in all of this. Maybe there's more going on than you realize. The weight of her words hung heavily in the air. Nora leaned back in her chair, her mind a storm of thoughts and emotions. Could it be true? Could Dylan have been forced into a marriage with Stella? It was hard to imagine. But then again, he had been so adamant about his choices, so resolute in his silence. Had she misjudged him all along? I don't know what to think anymore, Marissa, Nora admitted quietly, her voice thick with emotion. I feel like I'm drowning in all of this. Marissa reached across the table and grasped Nora's hand, her grip firm. I know, but I think you need to get the full picture before you make any more decisions. You've been through so much, Nora, but maybe it's time to uncover the truth once and for all. Nora nodded, her mind racing even faster now. She couldn't ignore this. She couldn't walk away without knowing the whole story. I'll do it, she said, her voice resolute. I'll find out what's really going on. Marissa gave her a sympathetic smile. I knew you would, and I'll be here every step of the way, I promise. Nora squeezed her hand in return, feeling a flicker of hope amid the confusion. She didn't know what this next chapter would bring, but she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't stay in the dark anymore. Dylan had been a part of her life for far too long, and if there was more to the story, she was going to find it. As the conversation turned to lighter topics, Nora's thoughts continued to swirl, the tension in her chest tightening with each passing minute. Whatever this truth was, it was going to change everything. She just hoped she was ready for it. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze, with Nora feeling oddly distant from everything around her. She couldn't shake the image of Dylan, his face filled with conflict, the weight of some hidden truth pressing down on him. She had always trusted him, but now, everything felt like it was slipping through her fingers. When she returned to the estate later that evening, she found herself standing in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. For the first time in a long time, she didn't recognize the woman who looked back at her. Her eyes were tired, her face drawn, and yet beneath it all, there was a spark, a desire to uncover the truth no matter the cost. The doorbell rang again, snapping her from her thoughts. Her heart raced as she made her way to the door, unsure of what to expect this time. Would it be Dylan, or someone else with more answers? She opened the door, her breath catching in her throat when she saw who was standing there. Dylan, she said softly, the uncertainty in her voice palpable. I need to talk to you, he said, his voice low and urgent. Nora's heart stilled as Dylan stepped over the threshold. She hadn't expected him to come, not after their last conversation. His face was pale, his expression tight with something that was neither anger nor regret, but something far darker. There was a weight in his gaze, one that she couldn't decipher, but it chilled her to the bone. Dylan, she began, but her voice trailed off, lost to the silence between them. He closed the door behind him with a soft click, then took a few steps into the room, his movements slow, deliberate. I know you probably don't want to hear anything from me right now, Dylan said, his voice raw and rough, as though each word was a battle. But I need you to listen to me. I need you to hear the truth. Nora's stomach twisted, the knot tightening as she studied him. His eyes, those eyes she had once trusted with everything, now seemed distant, haunted even, as though the weight of something unspoken was too much for him to bear. And suddenly, she realized that she wasn't just dealing with a man who had wronged her. She was dealing with a man who was broken. All right, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Tell me. Dylan exhaled a long breath, running a hand through his hair, a gesture that was both frustrated and exhausted. I never wanted to hurt you, Nora. I never wanted any of this. But I was caught in something that I couldn't escape, not without risking everything. And I don't think I can explain it in a way that makes sense, but I need you to know that I didn't choose to marry Stella. I didn't choose any of this. I didn't want to. His words were like shards of glass to Nora's chest. He didn't want to marry Stella. She had known there was more to his silence than he had let on, but hearing him say it, hearing him admit that his marriage had been forced upon him, was a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to confront. "Then why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you ever say anything? You let me believe, you let me think you chose her over me." "I didn't have a choice," Dylan's voice cracked, his hands trembling as he stepped closer to her. "You don't understand. My family, they would have destroyed everything. My business, my career, everything I've worked for. I had no other option. I thought that if I could just go along with it, if I could keep quiet and just let it happen, I'd be able to keep you safe. I didn't want you to get involved in it. I didn't want you to know what kind of person I had become." Nora recoiled, a surge of emotions sweeping through her. His words were devastating, but they also made her question everything she had believed about him. For years, she had told herself that the pain she felt was because he had chosen Stella, because he had lied and betrayed her. But now she didn't know what to believe anymore. "Why didn't you come to me?" Nora whispered, her eyes wet with unshed tears. "Why didn't you tell me what was happening? You never gave me a chance to help, you never gave us a chance." Dylan shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Because I was too damn scared, Nora. I was terrified. I thought I could protect you by staying away. I thought if I kept my distance, if I kept you out of it, you'd be safe from everything I was dealing with. But I was wrong. I should have trusted you. I should have told you from the start, but I didn't. And now I've ruined everything." Nora stood there, frozen in place as his words sank in. Her heart felt like it was being pulled in every direction, torn between the anger she had felt when she first learned about his marriage and the sorrow that flooded her now. The guilt in his eyes, the rawness of his voice, it was impossible to ignore. She had wanted an answer, but not like this. "You could have told me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You could have come to me and we could have figured something out, but instead you kept me in the dark, and now I don't know if I can trust anything you say." Dylan stepped forward, reaching for her hand, but she pulled back instinctively, the space between them growing wider. He looked at her, his face etched with desperation. "Nora, please," he begged. "I know I've hurt you. I know I've broken your trust, but I need you to understand that I never wanted this. I never wanted to lose you. I never wanted to push you away, but I thought that if I kept you out of it, it would keep you safe. It was the only way I could protect you. But now I see how much I've failed you." Tears blurred Nora's vision, and for the first time, she felt as if her heart was shattering all over again. She had loved him so fiercely, so completely, and the realization that he had kept such a monumental secret from her, one that could have changed everything, was more painful than anything she had ever felt. "Dylan," she said, her voice breaking, "I don't know what to say. I don't know how to fix this. You've torn everything apart. I've spent so long trying to understand what happened between us, and now you're telling me this?" Dylan lowered his head, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world was crashing down on him. "I know, Nora, I know, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I can't leave here without telling you the truth. I can't go on living with the lie." Nora's breath hitched in her chest as she stood motionless, torn between wanting to reach out to him and the part of her that screamed to walk away, to leave this behind. For a moment, the world seemed to fall silent around them. The pain, the betrayal, the years of confusion, it all felt so overwhelming. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to tell him how much he had hurt her. But instead, she found herself frozen in place, unable to speak. Then, slowly, as if the weight of everything she had been holding in had finally burst open, she whispered, "I don't know what to do with all of this." Dylan nodded, his face full of regret. "I know, I don't expect you to have the answers, but whatever you choose, I need you to know that I'm sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." The silence stretched between them, suffocating. Neither of them moved. Neither of them knew what the next step would be. For the first time, Nora realized that she had no idea what was coming next. But one thing was certain: whatever the future held, the truth had already changed everything. The chapter ends here, as Nora faces the truth that everything she thought she knew about Dylan and their relationship might not be what it seemed. The truth hung between them like a cloud, oppressive and dense, blocking out any light that might have remained. Nora stood still, her arms folded tightly across her chest, as if trying to hold herself together. Dylan's apology echoed in her mind, a refrain she didn't know how to process. Everything he had said, everything he had admitted, felt like a weight pushing her down, but it wasn't the only thing pressing on her heart. There was still the question of what to do next, how to proceed when all the rules had changed. She couldn't tell if she wanted to scream or cry, if she wanted to rage at him, or hold him close and pretend that none of this had happened. She didn't know if she could ever forgive him, if she could ever trust him again. The life she had imagined for herself, the future she had built in her heart, was slipping through her fingers like sand. The idea that everything was built on a lie, that Dylan hadn't been the man she thought he was more than she could handle. But still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going on, that there was more to the story than what he had told her. Something about his apology felt incomplete. It was sincere, but there was a depth of emotion in his eyes that she couldn't place. It was like he was carrying a burden far heavier than just his mistakes. "Dylan," Nora said, her voice trembling, "I don't know what to believe anymore." Dylan looked at her, his gaze soft but filled with an intensity she couldn't ignore. "I know, and I don't blame you, but please just hear me out. Let me explain it all. Everything." There was a long pause, the silence almost suffocating. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in on them both. Nora wanted to push him away, to tell him to leave her alone, but instead, she found herself listening, wondering if she could uncover some deeper truth that would make sense of the mess they were both in. "What's going on, Dylan?" she asked, finally breaking the silence. Her voice was steadier now, though still laced with doubt and uncertainty. "What aren't you telling me?" Dylan ran his hand through his hair again, his eyes flashing with a flicker of fear. "It's not just about Stella," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's about my family. They've always controlled everything in my life. My choices, my future, my marriage, everything. I've been trying to break free, but it's like they have me trapped. They knew about you, Nora, and they knew I'd never be able to go through with a marriage to someone I didn't love. So they made it clear, if I didn't do what they wanted, they would destroy everything I cared about." Nora's mind was racing as she processed his words. Dylan's family? It made sense in a way. His family had always been distant, powerful, controlling. But she never imagined that they had this kind of hold over him. "You mean they forced you into this marriage?" she asked, her voice trembling as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Dylan nodded, his eyes darkening. "Yes, but that's not all. They also have leverage over me, Nora. Things that they could use to ruin me. Things they could use to make sure I'd never be free. Stella, she's been a part of that. She's been working with them the entire time." Nora's heart skipped a beat. "What? Stella?" Dylan grimaced, his expression pained. "She's not the person you think she is, Nora. She's been playing a game this whole time, and I was too blind to see it. She's been using me, using my family's power to get what she wants. I thought I could control it. I thought I could keep her at arm's length, but I was wrong, and now everything's falling apart." Dylan's words hit Nora like a punch to the gut. She had always known there was something off about Stella, something calculating and cold. But hearing it from Dylan, hearing him admit that she had been working against them both, was a revelation that left her reeling. "How long has this been going on?" she asked, her voice low, her eyes searching his face for the truth. Dylan swallowed hard. "Since before we even met. They've been planning this for years, using me as a pawn. I thought if I could just go along with it, if I could just play their game for a little while longer, I'd be able to break free. But now I've let everything slip through my fingers." Nora felt her stomach churn as the weight of his words settled in. It wasn't just about love, or loyalty, or betrayal. It was about power. Dylan had been trapped in a game of family politics, caught between the man he wanted to be and the man his family forced him to be. The realization stung more than she wanted to admit. "You can't keep running from this, Dylan," she said softly, her voice heavy with a quiet determination. "You have to face it. You have to stop letting them control you." Dylan's eyes hardened, his jaw clenched as though the words physically pained him. "I know, I don't know how to stop it. I don't know how to fight back." "Then we'll fight together," Nora said, her voice steady now, a sense of resolve settling in her chest. "But you have to trust me. You have to tell me everything. We can't fix this if you're still hiding things. There was a long pause, a moment where Dylan seemed to struggle with the weight of her words. But then, slowly, he nodded. I'll do whatever it takes, Nora, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll fight, but I need you to stand by me. I can't do this alone. The silence between them was no longer suffocating, it was filled with a quiet understanding, a sense of shared purpose. Nora didn't know if she could ever fully trust Dylan again. But at that moment, she knew one thing: she wasn't going to let him face this alone. Together, they would face whatever was coming, and no matter how dark or dangerous the road ahead, they would fight back against the forces that had tried to tear them apart. The chapter ends as Nora and Dylan prepare to confront the forces working against them. Their relationship, once defined by betrayal and confusion, begins to shift toward a shared resolve. Nora and Dylan stood at the threshold of a war they were both prepared for. The weight of everything that had happened, all the lies and betrayals, the manipulation by Dylan's family and Stella, hung heavily on their shoulders. But as they prepared for the battle ahead, something changed in them both. It was no longer just about revenge. It was about reclaiming their lives, their choices, and their futures. They had spent days strategizing, poring over information, aligning allies, and gathering resources. Dylan had revealed more about his family's tactics, the way they had used their wealth and influence to control him, the way they had blackmailed him into doing their bidding. Nora had spent hours researching every angle, finding leverage, figuring out how to disrupt their empire. They weren't just trying to fight for Dylan's freedom anymore. They were fighting for the truth to be known, for the power that had been wielded against them to finally be taken down. The final showdown was looming, and neither of them could afford to make mistakes. Nora's hand clenched around the stack of documents she had secured. They were the key to dismantling everything: the proof of the illegal deals, the manipulation, the way Dylan's family had used him as a pawn in their games. These were the things they would use to expose them all. The idea of taking down the very people who had built their empire on deceit and control brought a thrill of determination to Nora's chest. But there was still one more piece to the puzzle: Stella. She had been a constant shadow in their lives, slipping through the cracks, manipulating everyone she came into contact with. Now, it was time to face her head-on. The showdown wasn't just going to be with Dylan's family, it was going to be with her. Nora had always known Stella had her claws deep in Dylan's life, but now she realized just how dangerous and calculating she truly was. Every move Stella had made was meant to keep Dylan under her thumb, to make sure he would never escape the trap she had set for him. She had played the role of the loving fiancé for so long, but that was only part of the game. "What's the plan?" Dylan asked, his voice low, filled with a mixture of dread and resolve. Nora turned to face him, her expression set in stone. "We expose them. We use everything we have. Your family can't fight against the truth. We're going to make sure the world knows what they've been doing. And Stella, will make her show her true face." Dylan nodded, his eyes filled with a dark fire. "I'll do whatever it takes. We have to end this." The next few hours passed in a blur of frantic activity. They finalized their plan, setting up meetings with the right people, preparing their message, and organizing the materials they needed to send the shockwaves through Dylan's family. The calm before the storm felt almost surreal, like they were standing on the edge of a precipice, looking down at the abyss, but knowing that stepping forward was the only way to survive. It was time. They arrived at the location where everything would come to a head: the massive, imposing mansion that had been the heart of Dylan's family's empire. Every inch of it screamed power, control, and wealth, from the polished marble floors to the cold, sterile atmosphere of the place. But tonight, it wasn't going to be the fortress of invincibility it had been for so long. Tonight, it was going to be the place where everything changed. They entered the mansion with a calm demeanor, but underneath it all, the adrenaline was coursing through Nora's veins. She could feel her pulse racing, her mind sharp as she prepared for the confrontation ahead. There were too many variables, too many moving parts, but they had no choice but to proceed. This was the only way to break free from the chains that had bound them both for so long. "Remember," Nora whispered to Dylan as they made their way deeper into the house, "we have everything we need. Stick to the plan, keep your head." Dylan gave her a tight nod, his hand briefly brushing hers. The small, fleeting connection grounded her, a reminder that they weren't in this alone. They found their way to the grand hall, where a dinner party was taking place. The guests were unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Dylan's parents and other key members of his family were there, along with several high-profile business associates. It was a carefully orchestrated affair, a display of power and wealth. But what they didn't know was that their empire was about to come crumbling down. Nora and Dylan made their entrance, their presence drawing immediate attention. Whispers spread like wildfire as people turned to look, their gazes filled with curiosity and suspicion. But Nora wasn't here to play games anymore. She had no patience left for the masks they all wore, pretending to be something they weren't. Her eyes found Stella almost immediately, standing near the center of the room, her smile as cold and calculated as ever. Her eyes flickered with recognition when she saw Nora, but there was no warmth, only a silent challenge in her gaze. "Stella," Nora said, her voice cutting through the noise. The room fell silent, the tension palpable as everyone turned to watch the exchange. "It's time to stop pretending. The truth is coming out, and you're going to have to answer for everything you've done." Stella's smile faltered for just a moment before she regained her composure. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice smooth, but with an underlying edge of nervousness. "Oh, I think you do," Nora replied, stepping forward. She pulled out the stack of documents she had prepared and slapped them down on the table. "These will make everything clear." The room fell completely silent as the guests began to look between the documents and the people involved, their shock palpable. Stella's expression darkened, her eyes flicking nervously to Dylan's parents, who stood frozen, watching the unfolding drama. Dylan stepped forward, his voice cold and controlled. "My family's been using me for years, and Stella has been working with them to control my every move. It's all in these files." He placed his hand over the pile of documents. "You're all going to learn the truth tonight." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Stella's facade cracked, revealing the fear that she had fought so hard to keep hidden. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "You can't do this," she finally spat, her composure completely shattered. "You don't know what you're doing." "You're right," Nora said, her voice steady as she faced her adversary. "But I do know that I'm done being manipulated, and so is Dylan. This ends now." The storm that had been gathering in the air for so long finally broke. Dylan's family tried to rally, but it was too late. The truth was out, and there was no way to take it back. The climax had arrived. It wasn't just the battle for freedom anymore. It was the fight for justice, for truth, and for the future they had once dreamed of, but had almost lost forever. Nora and Dylan had stepped into the lion's den, and they had taken control. The world was watching. The aftermath was swift and unforgiving. What had started as a quiet rebellion, a slow and steady push against years of manipulation and deceit, erupted into a full-blown public scandal. The documents, containing undeniable proof of the illegal dealings, the blackmail, and the ways Dylan's family had controlled his every move, made their way into the hands of the media. The first reports began to trickle out, and within hours, they had become the story of the decade. The family that had once seemed untouchable, with their perfect facade of power, wealth, and influence, began to crumble. People who had once revered them now recoiled, seeing them for what they truly were: cruel manipulators who had ruined lives in their relentless pursuit of control. It was surreal to watch. The mansion that had stood as a symbol of power now seemed hollow, its cold walls echoing with the faint remnants of broken promises and lost dreams. Dylan's parents, once towering figures in the business world, were now scrambling to cover their tracks, facing legal battles and a public outcry that had no end in sight. And Stella, the woman who had been at the center of it all, was left with nothing but her carefully constructed lies. She tried to fight back, of course. She tried to manipulate the narrative, turning the media against Dylan, playing the role of the victim. But there was no use. The truth had already been set free, and nothing she said could change that. Nora watched as the pieces fell into place. It felt like justice, like everything she had worked for was finally coming to fruition. But even with the success, there was no real joy in it, no triumphant celebration. She had done what needed to be done, but she knew that the scars left by the years of manipulation would never truly disappear. The battle had been won, but it had come at a heavy cost. Dylan stood by her side, his hand resting on her shoulder as they watched the events unfold. His face was a mix of exhaustion and relief, a man who had been dragged through hell and was now finally able to stand on his own 2 feet. There was a rawness in his eyes, a vulnerability he had never shown before. "It's over," he said softly, his voice hoarse. "It's really over." Nora nodded, her eyes scanning the busy streets outside the window. The city had always felt like a jungle of contradictions, but now it felt like a place of possibility. The future wasn't certain, but it was theirs to shape. For the first time in a long time, they both had the freedom to choose their own paths. "I never thought it would end like this," Dylan continued, his gaze distant. "But I'm glad it's finally over. I'm glad it's finally us." There was a silence between them, one that felt comfortable, as though the world had finally slowed down enough for them to breathe. Nora's mind drifted to the future, to the possibilities that lay ahead. She had fought for this freedom, for herself, for Dylan, for both of them. But now, it was time to decide what to do with it. "What now?" she asked, her voice filled with both curiosity and a quiet excitement. Dylan turned toward her, his expression thoughtful. "We rebuild, we start over, together." Nora's heart swelled with emotion. The weight of the last few months had been crushing, but now, standing there with Dylan, it felt like a new beginning. The future wasn't going to be easy, nothing worth having ever was, but for the first time in so long, she felt hopeful. She had fought for this life, for the right to live on her own terms, and she had won. Now she could decide what to do with it. The days that followed were filled with a quiet sense of liberation. Dylan and Nora, no longer bound by the oppressive forces that had shaped their lives, took small steps toward healing. There were phone calls to make, people to apologize to, and relationships to rebuild, but each day felt like a small victory. It wasn't a perfect journey, but it was their journey. Dylan found himself stepping into a new role, one where he was in charge of his own life. He started to rebuild his career, focusing on the things that truly mattered to him. No longer was he tied to his family's wealth and legacy. Now, he could choose his own path, even if it meant starting from the ground up. Nora, too, found her place in the world. She had always been strong, but now she discovered a strength she hadn't fully known existed within her. She began working on projects that aligned with her values, using her skills and knowledge to create something meaningful. She wasn't just a survivor of the past, she was a force, carving out a future on her own terms. As they spent more time together, their relationship deepened. It wasn't without its challenges. The scars of the past would never fully fade, and they both had moments of doubt and insecurity. But they learned to lean on each other, to be honest, and to confront their fears together. It wasn't always easy, but it was real, and that made all the difference. One evening, a few months after everything had settled down, Dylan and Nora stood on the balcony of their small apartment, looking out over the city. The skyline stretched out before them, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. It was a quiet moment, one that felt like a reflection of everything they had fought for. Nora turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "You're different," she said softly. Dylan chuckled, the sound rich with both amusement and something deeper. "I think we both are," she smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "I'm glad we made it through together." "Me too," he replied, his hand finding hers. "We've still got a long way to go, but I'm ready for it." And for the first time in a long time, Nora felt at peace. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and the ghosts of the past would always linger in the background, but she wasn't afraid anymore. With Dylan by her side, they could face whatever came next. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, it was full of possibilities. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they stood there, hand in hand, ready to face whatever the world had in store for them. Together.